Hello, everyone. I am Philip Tai, Director of the Northeastern University Asian Studies Program and Associate Professor of History and Asian Studies. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce this inaugural speaker series, Asia, America, and the World, featuring our leadoff speaker, Professor Russell Jeung. We'll begin with a few introductory remarks from David Madigan, Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, followed by Carl Reed, Senior Vice Provost and Chief Inclusion Officer. I will then offer a few introductory remarks of my own before introducing our speaker today. So Provost Madigan, I would now like to invite you to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for being. Can't really hear me. You're 6 feet away, so I'm good. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here at the beginning of this series, and thanks to Professor Jeung for being here. In response to the tragic murders back in March of 8 people in Atlanta, including 6 Asian and Asian American women, Northeastern hosted a virtual town hall at that time to reflect on the tragedy and to condemn the growing number of racist attacks of that type. The president at that time charged Chancellor Ken Henderson and Chief Inclusion Officer Carl Reed, who's here with us, with developing a university-wide plan to create a culture of inclusion that welcomes and supports all communities, but with a special focus on Asian, Pacific Islander, Desi Americans, that community. So this speaker series is part of that effort to create this culture of inclusion. It is but the first step. But I'm very glad that we're doing it, and there's a wonderful set of speakers who are going to come over the course of the next of the semester, and I'm thrilled we're doing this. I want to thank Philip Tai, Mika Morikawa Zhao, who's here. Thank you very much for making this happen. Thank you, Mika, and Ezra Acevedo, also, who is there, and I apologize if I made a mess of that name. Also the Asian Studies Program and the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and Dean Poiger for organizing this exciting series on behalf of the entire university. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Madigan, and thank you also for your leadership as well. The task force that he mentioned that President Aoun kind of announced in early April was kind of put in place really by Provost Madigan and Chancellor Henderson as well. And there was a major effort as he talked about this university-wide plan to address it, but it was going to build on a broader strategy that was announced last June of 2020. After the murder of George Floyd. So as many of you know, tragedies lead to sort of catalysts, a catalyst of action as well. The pandemic in and of itself has catalyzed the way we eat now, we catalyze the way we shop, catalyze healthcare and education as well. Many of those. George Floyd's murder was also a catalysis in terms of how we reckon with race, and the whole concept of becoming an anti-racist was a part of our lexicon as a result. And certainly the March 6th murders of 8 people in Atlanta was another catalyst for us as well. As a result of that effort, Provost Madigan talked about sort of this group of people that came together to really develop a plan, a strategy around how we are going to address this. It started, of course, with the open letter that many of the students wrote, 73 pages, and I read them all, in terms of the things that we needed to do as a university to be better for the populations that we served. And I approach my work as a Chief Inclusion Officer at 4 steps, typically. It's listen, learn, plan, and act. And it's a cyclical process because we never really stop learning. we never really stopped listening. And so the first thing we did was we began to listen, and we heard from students. We met with the student leaders in the Asian American Center and others to understand what their requirements are and their voice, and to hear their voice as well. And many of those meetings were in the evenings. Chancellor Henderson participated in those evenings, and we started to understand, but also to learn that Asian is not a monolith. It is multicultural. It brings so many different languages and perspectives as well. And so speaking and understanding kind of the nuances that are within our organization. The plan involved two major strategies. One is to enhance the student experience. And so we put in a lot of investment to the cultural centers to expand the space and hear and develop the staff and ensure that the staff fill the need in the cultural centers, including the Asian American Center as well. And then we are looking at the curriculum across the board, making sure that there are gaps in our curriculum that have to be closed so that our students have opportunities to learn not only about themselves but about others as well. We're rolling out with the leadership of our Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, Philip He, an anti-racist training program that for all staff and faculty and students across the university as well. And then, of course, reinvigorating the Asian Studies speaker series, which is what this is all about. And so this brings us to where we are today. And I'm delighted and thrilled to be a part of the launch of this series as well, and under the direction of our new Asian Studies leader, Philip Tai. And so we're going to continue to listen, and we're going to listen as part of this, but we're going to grow as a university, ultimately to become much more an inclusive community, inclusive campus, and prepare our students and faculty and staff to serve the world. So thank you so very much, and I appreciate this opportunity and appreciate your being here.
Thank you, Provost Madigan, Senior Vice Provost Reed, for your words of support. Let me just say two important things about this series. First, this series has invited a diverse slate of scholars to look at a range of critical issues. Issues including the problem of racism and xenophobia, the problem of inequality, the impact of global capitalism, the impact of foreign interventions, and so much more. Now, these issues may affect Asians, Asian Americans, and the broader Asian diaspora specifically, but they do not affect them exclusively. In other words, these are issues that confront almost every one of us. And I therefore hope that a broad audience will find this series of interest and discover how this series will speak to them. Second, I also want to thank other supporters of the series, including Vice Provost Phil He, Dean Uta Poiger for offering the necessary assistance. But most importantly, I want to recognize the army of people, not an exaggeration, the army of people who did the hard work that made this event and this series possible. Our Asian Studies program team, Mika Morikawa-Jo and Ezra Acevedo, the CSSH team of Jen Grieve and Gabby Fiorenza, the marketing and communications team of Mike Farah, Najima Hollis-Huggins, and Megan Donovan, Rachel Mu and her staff at the Asian American Center, and even Jackie Lee in the San Francisco campus for connecting us to the speaker in the first place. So this event has been a collective effort, and I hope that we can all recognize everyone collectively for their efforts. And without further ado, let me now introduce our speaker today. Russell Jeung is Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He is the author of numerous studies on race and religion, the most recent of which include Family Sacrifices, the Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. Professor Jeung also co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with the organization Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. Stop AAPI Hate has tracked incidents of COVID-19 discrimination with the aim of developing policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. Professor Jeung has also notified me that he has been named as one of the Time 100 most influential people, so he is hoping to leverage some of that attention to much more enduring causes and solutions. So his talk today is entitled Anti-AAPI Hate in the Time of COVID-19. Please join me in welcoming Professor Russell Jeung.
Thank you, Professor Tai. Thank you, Provost Madigan, Provost Reed, for the warm welcome to Northeastern. I've been here for the day and have been really impressed by the faculty and staff, for Mika and Ezra's hospitality and organization and coordination. Thank you very much. And I've also been especially impressed by the staff of the Asian American Center, Rachel and her staff members, of their advocacy and their leadership and their commitment to the students. And so thank you for your hospitality, for inviting us today. I'm also really impressed by the students here at Northeastern. Again, not only for their intelligence and professionalism in the co-ops, but I'm really impressed by their activism. And I heard about the open letter. To hear about a 73-page document, that's a thesis that they could actually submit for a PhD perhaps. But it is a powerful tool for advocacy, and I want to really commend the students for actually bringing me here today, because this is the inaugural talk for this series, and if it weren't for the students, then this talk wouldn't occur. So we hope this isn't just a one-off. Yeah, so thank you, students. So yeah, this isn't just the inaugural, but hopefully it'll be a continuing series and then the beginning of a foundation for Asian American studies as a whole at Northeastern. So today I actually want to talk about how to build an anti-racist movement, learning from the Black Lives Matter movement, learning from other movements, and especially using Stop AAPI Hate as a case study. And so these are some of the topics I'll be talking about. How we develop a critical consciousness as individuals, and then as a community, how we were mobilized. And eventually, then how do we actually make concrete change that isn't just a moment, but is a movement that lasts. So we at Stop AAPI Hate don't want to just stop racism. We want to build a movement for racial justice that's ongoing and enduring. So I hope you'll join me as you accompany Stop AAPI Hate and become part of that movement as well. We created Stop AAPI Hate last year in March 2020 because we knew from Asian American history, and if you learn it in ethnic studies, we knew that whenever a pandemic comes from Asia, Asians get blamed, Asians face racist violence, and Asians face racist policies. That's been our history. And so we knew when COVID came that the same will happen, and we wanted to be ready this time. So I worked with two other nonprofits, civil rights organizations, Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, to form a coalition, Stop AAPI Hate. And we actually first went to the California Attorney General and asked him, can you create a reporting center? And he said we didn't have the capacity, even though we do believe it's government's responsibility to safeguard the community. It's government's responsibility to fight racism. It's government's community to protect the welfare of Asian Americans. Because he didn't have the capacity, we created our own website, and in March we launched, and immediately we were flooded with hundreds of incidents, and they were just horrific. The hate and anger directed towards Asians was just palpable, and they came from all over, and they continue even to this day. So the surge has continued for the last year and a half, sadly. And to give you a sense of what we're receiving on a daily basis, I'm going to have two students read to you some reports that we've actually received from elders. And you don't often think of Asian American senior citizens or immigrants or limited English speaking going online and complaining, but they are, because they know mistreatment when they experience. They know what racism is, and they don't necessarily want individual redress. They don't want to punish the perpetrators. They just want it to stop for their community. So it's a sense of collective justice that they want. So as you listen to these incidents, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these elders, or even imagine your own grandparents. And think about how you feel, and I'm going to ask you afterwards to just shout out some of the words you feel. Now, I just actually want to warn you, this can be triggering for you, so be mindful. And so those of you who are watching on Zoom, you could put in the chat some of the words that you feel. Okay.
A litany of lament. Customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I am mostly Chinese, and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since the 1860s. I am 4th generation in San Luis Obispo, but guess I will never be an American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and the back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy.
I was standing in line in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with "Shut up, you monkey," "F you, Chinaman, go back to China," bringing that Chinese virus over here.
On my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings.
My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when 2 dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs," then said, "You need to go back to where you came from." We were shocked to hear this.
Waiting to enter to get prescription, group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of me, fake coughing, spitting, and made slant eyes. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Mother came up to me and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home, but this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977.
As I was leaving the restaurant, white males stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you fucking Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to an officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone.
Thank you. So what's some of your emotional responses? Just a few words, you could shout them out. Sad. Anger.
Fear. Helplessness.
Sadness.
Frustration.
Shamefulness, devastation.
Thanks. So I think you get a sense of what the Asian American community is feeling at this moment. It's been a year-long period of collective racial trauma. These feelings of anger, distress, helplessness, sadness, it continues because we see these incidents occur again and again. And when we see it on the news, even though it doesn't impact us maybe individually, we experience it vicariously. That's the nature of racial violence. That's the nature of collective violence, is that we feel it because we could see ourselves in those incidents. We could see our parents or grandparents in these incidents. And so I'm arguing that what we're experiencing now as a community is actually akin to Japanese American incarceration. It's not the same experiences, but it's going to have the same long-term impact. It has the same traumatizing impact, and I'm going to share about that today. So this isn't your standard academic talk. It's sort of an inside look of what a community is experiencing at the moment. This is the data that we've received from Stop AAPI Hate. Through the end of March, we received over 9,000 incidents of racism. The Pew Research Center says that 45% of Asian Americans experienced direct racism in the past year. So our data is just the tip of the iceberg. 45% means there were 8 million acts of hate last year. The hate aren't all hate crimes. And so although the media sort of portrays it as a hate crime issue, it's broader than that. It's more comprehensive than that. You can see on the bottom, they fall under 4 main categories of racism. On the bottom, you see civil rights violations. They make up about 11% of the cases. We're getting mistreated by our employers at the workplace, being barred from ride shares, being barred from restaurants and hotels. Online harassment makes up 8% of the incidents. And so you see racist posts, you see offensive memes. Actually, this is really low. So our youth campaign just did a study this year, and high schoolers said 70% of them had seen offensive racist posts in the last month. 70%, right? And if you're on the screen a lot, you get used to seeing this type of attack. Verbal harassment and avoidance. Avoidance is, directly, deliberately avoiding Asians, make up the bulk of our incidents. They're often called microaggressions because they're maybe in the workplace, at a store, but they're not micro in impact. As you heard in the stories, they're often virulent attacks where racial epithets are employed, where slurs are slung. Oftentimes it's gang bullying. So think of yourself, you hear stories of people just stalking elderly, pushing a baby stroller for blocks, just hurling insults at them. What kind of people do that? They're American because it's happening everywhere. We did a study of our response to Stop AAPI Hate, and 1 out of 5 respondents now show signs of racial trauma. That's 3 or more long-term symptoms of issues like depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, where they're always looking out for themselves, and avoidance. Those are the hallmarks of trauma. And that's why we're saying this is a period of collective racial trauma. 1 out of 5 experience it directly. The rest of us experience it vicariously. The last category is physical assault. We're getting coughed and spat upon at such a high rate that we actually created a special checkoff category. Someone coughed on me. People ask, how do you know there's a surge in racism? And I think in 2019, I didn't hear of anybody spitting on their fellow human being. But here, now, it happens again on a daily basis. My own wife was running on a trail. Someone just blocked her path and deliberately coughed in her face. A person in New England coughed on the produce and then coughed on the cashier. He was arrested for terrorism. So you could argue Asian Americans are now experiencing mass terrorism because it's happening to us in such a widespread manner. Physical assault make up 14% of our cases, and these can constitute hate crimes. We're getting pushed and shoved. We're having bottles and rocks thrown at us. People try to run us over with their cars. This happens so much in the incident reports that I wasn't surprised, sadly, when elderly were killed early this year. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shooting, sadly, because, again, the hate is just palpable. The trends have been consistent, too, over the last year and a half. Women are attacked twice as much as men. Elderly and young people are also targeted. It's because bullies attack those whom they think they can bully. It's also a clear case of racial profiling. Although China is blamed for COVID-19, 60% of our respondents are non-Chinese. So if you look Chinese, you can get attacked, right? So the 60% include Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean. A Latino person in LA was punched and told to go back to China. An indigenous person in Vancouver was attacked and told to go back to China. So this is what's happening. And then the question arises, well, why? Why the surge in racism because of the pandemic? The virus doesn't discriminate, so why is America discriminating? And there's 3 main factors, 3 primary sources of this racism that I'd like to talk about: the political rhetoric, the media representations, and the yellow peril stereotype. Clearly, people were afraid of the pandemic, but the political rhetoric and the term Chinese virus really then inflamed the racism. This term, and it's bipartisan, it's not just Republican. This term, Chinese virus, did two things. What it did is it took a biological virus and racialized it. It assigned Chinese characteristics to the virus. And secondly, it stigmatized the people so that Chinese people were seen to be the ones carrying the disease, right? So the virus being Chinese and Chinese having the virus, that association was made when the president again and again insisted on using the term Chinese virus. That term then went viral on social media, and that hate speech led to hate violence. What happened is when he began to use that term Chinese virus again and again, and people began to see representations of the virus being Chinese, it actually created that association, it created that nexus that actually became part of our implicit bias. This is actually what happens within our neuropsychology. If you make that association time and time again, it actually chemically hardwires in your brain the association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus, right? When you hear it and see it time and time again. And so this is actually a viral post. This is a party at the University of Albany where they had a coronavirus party. And the students drank Corona beer with pictures of Chinese people wearing masks. Some of the pictures had Chinese with their eyes X'd out as if they had died from the pandemic. But this is how students are partying, right? This is another viral post about a Chinese person eating a bat, the supposed source of the disease. So again, when the term is heard again and again, when the representation is employed again and again, it chemically hardwires in your brain that association. People carry around that association, and when people are already afraid of the pandemic, then when they see Asians, they have an automatic response to Asians, right? That's how racial schema works. You make an automatic response and you get triggered, and you go into a fight or flight response. It's the same way when you see a growling dog, right? You don't stop and think, the dog's growling, the dog has its teeth bared, the dog's looking angry. You have an automatic response to that dog. And in the same way, I think people were making an automatic triggered response to the threat of Asians. And they would go into fight mode and attack us, or they would go into flight mode and shun us. We're not saying everyone's intentionally racist, but we are saying people are using implicit biases to make automatic assumptions when they racially profile Asians. You get it? This is how racism is often unconscious and unintentional. I would argue I had that implicit bias. If I saw an Asian wearing a mask, I would think that person is more likely to be infected than a non-Asian wearing a mask, right? So we all carry these sort of racial ideas in our head. But that fear of Asians that triggers us is associated to the yellow peril stereotype. This is a long-standing stereotype that may be part of America's racial subconscious. We may not even be aware of it, but hidden, lurking beneath our subconscious is this fear of Asians, especially if you're from the West. The yellow peril stereotype is that Asians, with their hordes of people, would come and invade the West with their masses of people and with their disease-ridden bodies. And if you watch movies, actually Shang-Chi is sort of based on Fu Manchu, who had the same idea of a mastermind, but now we like the mastermind coming in and attacking the West. But sadly, this yellow peril stereotype gets invoked time and time again in American history. And let me give you a couple of examples so you can know your Asian American history. In the 19th century, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen to be specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown, right? So again, disease associated with Chinese, just like the Chinese virus. Because Chinese were seen to be disease-ridden, because Chinese were seen to take away white workers' jobs, Congress then passed the 1882 Exclusion Act, the first act that actually excluded an entire ethnic community. You have racist policies associated with racial violence. At the same time in the 19th century, over 200 Chinese settlements were forcibly driven out. These weren't just individual lynchings. These were entire communities forcibly removed by white mob violence. So I don't know if you can hear this history, but my own family settled in Monterey, California, by the museum or the aquarium. And people didn't like the Chinese being there, and so the landlord evicted the Chinese. When the Chinese wouldn't move, a fire burned down the entire village. 200 people had to leave. The landlord then bulldozed the village, their homes, into the ocean and fenced off the area so Chinese couldn't return. My great-grandparents, who had lived there for 4 decades, raised families, built a thriving business. They had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of safety from racism. Again, it wasn't just my family. This happened 200 times. History repeated itself again in 1900. The bubonic plague was found in Chinatown, so health officials quarantined the area, segregated the area. They allowed whites to leave and kept Chinese inside with ropes and patrols who kept them in. It's sort of like COVID-19 quarantine, but enforced by the police. In Santa Ana and Honolulu Chinatowns, the health officials actually burned down the entire Chinatowns, leaving thousands homeless. And ironically, that spread the rats who had the disease, right? So this Chronicle article says, there's eerie parallels to today. Disease comes from Asia, Asians blamed, Asians face racist policies, Asians face racist attacks. It occurred again in Angel Island. When Chinese came, they were seen to be disease-ridden and to be illegal aliens. And so the period to process Chinese coming through took weeks. Whereas if you're a European going through Ellis Island, it would take hours. You could disembark in a day. Chinese were detained on Angel Island and had to go through physical checkups. If found to be medically unfit, they would get deported. So 10 to 30% of the Chinese spent their entire family fortunes to make it to America, to take care of their families, never made it to California shores because they were sent back for really arbitrary health reasons like hookworm. Later on, in the 1940s, tuberculosis was a disease that disproportionately impacted Latinos and Asians. It's because of environmental racism. We were segregated in crowded, squalid residences. The health policy was to separate families if you were found to have the disease. And so both sides of my family, my father's side and my mom's side, had long-term family separation because of this racialized health policy. So because of race and because of health policy, my own family has experienced exclusion, segregation, quarantine, detention, deportation, and long-term family separation. It's not because my family has certain physical health issues. It's because we're Chinese American that we had to experience this racial trauma. That's the yellow peril in effect. So, last year we talked about George Floyd. Asian American community really was thrown into an identity crisis because not only were we sort of saddened and aggrieved and distraught that George Floyd was killed, but we actually saw an Asian police officer holding back the crowds while Derek Chauvin killed him. And because we're a community of color, we can't distance ourselves from a co-ethnic. We actually saw ourselves in him. And we knew that other people don't distinguish us from him, right? They associate us with him. And so we had to wonder, are we complicit with this system of mass incarceration? Are we part of white supremacy? Or are we really in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? So you understand the quandary that Asian Americans face, right? Are we part of a system that's oppressive? Or are we part of a system that oppresses us? At the same time, as we wonder where we fit in America's racial hierarchy, we also recognize we're neither white nor black. And race relations is often discussed in a white-black binary. Racial history in the US is often a white-black context. Racial politics is often white-black. Asians and Latinos were often omitted And so we don't even feel like we belong. We don't fit in, right? Because we're not even discussed. We're invisibilized. So that's the crisis that Asian Americans faced. Not only are we, again, part of a system that's oppressive, but we're also trying to figure out, well, where do we fit in? How do we connect to this racial hierarchy of the US? At the same time, as the Black Lives Matter movement was emerging, or wasn't emerging, but actually in the news, we also recognized that we were being racialized as Asian Americans, but in a different way. So this is a real important thing for us to understand, that Asians, being neither white nor black, still face racism, still face racialization, but it's in a different sense, in a different way. And actually, Latinos, Arabs, other groups are often racialized in this way. It's whether you're an insider to America where you really belong, or whether you're an outsider, a foreigner who don't belong. This is whether you're a native or a foreigner. Sometimes Asians are considered real Americans. We're model minorities. We're white adjacent. If we win a gold medal, then we're really American, right? But this status of really fitting in, of belonging to America, is really conditional. And so in times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, in times of economic distress, such as when Vincent Chin in the 1980s was killed because auto workers who were laid off blamed him for their economic distress. They were white auto workers and they blamed Japan. They thought this Chinese American was Japanese, so they killed him. And in times of pandemic, Asians are more portrayed and treated as foreigners, outsiders, the yellow peril to be excluded. Again, last year we had all three conditions. We had the pandemic, we had the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we had the US-China Cold War. So all these conditions and all these factors have led to us being treated as a perpetual foreigner. I would argue this stereotype has been much more operative than this stereotype. They're both false, but this one is really impacting Asians because we're perceived as foreigners. And you know America treats foreigners really badly, right? We build walls against foreigners, we separate the families of borders, and apparently if Asians are seen as foreigners, it's okay to spit and cough on us. It's okay to push our elders around. Because we're seen as outsiders, either to the nation or to a neighborhood, that's led, again, to the widespread racism, the trauma, and the deaths. So again, these community of colors are all being oppressed by a system that oppresses us, that subjugates us, that stereotypes us, but in different ways. And I see the Stop AAPI Hate movement working in partnership with Black Lives Matter. We're just trying to dismantle different sites of white supremacy, but together we're trying to overall create a new system. You could see how this insider-outsider binary operates when you take an intersectional analysis of what happened with the Atlanta shootings. An intersectional analysis is, looking at both how race and gender intersect, combine to lead to specific types of oppression. So the insider model is, if you look at how Asian women are portrayed by Hollywood, by popular media, is that they're often seen as China dolls, quiet and docile, appropriate for the white male gaze. But if we're outsiders, Asian women are seen as dragon ladies, hypersexualized, threatening to be excluded, right? Either portrayal on the insider-outsider binary objectifies women, doesn't treat them as fully human, fetishizes Asian women. And because of this fetishization of Asian women, the Atlanta shooter, even though he had a sex addiction, he went out of his way to drive and attack and shoot at Asian businesses, right? He went out of his way to kill Asian women because I don't think he saw them as human, as fully human. That's the objectification. That's the stereotyping. That's the yellow peril at work. So the impacts of racism on our community have been deadly, they've been traumatizing, and they've had serious other impacts as well. Asian Americans are the racial group with the highest rate of mental health distress during the pandemic. Northeastern students may also be probably subject to this. And those of us who experience racism have higher rates of depression, stress, and anxiety. Here's one of my takeaway facts I want you to know about. When we asked Stop AAPI Hate respondents, what's your greatest stressor during the pandemic? What's your greatest fear? They overwhelmingly said racism. Think about this. Asian Americans are more worried about other Americans' hate than we are of a pandemic that's killed over 650,000 people. You think, what could be more scary than a global pandemic? Well, it's other Americans. That's how widespread this racism is. That's how traumatizing it is. That's how deadly it is. We could put masks on to protect ourselves from COVID, but you can't get vaccinated from other Americans' hate. So I think that's also impacting Northeastern students. You're already worried about the pandemic. You're already facing economic distress because maybe your families were laid off, but you're also worried about your family members, right? Whether your grandma will be safe. Because of racism, people were avoiding Asian businesses. They were avoiding Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese nail salons, and so those businesses closed early, even before government shutdowns. As a result, the Asian American community has the highest rate of unemployment after blacks. Large swaths of our working class community have been impacted by racism economically. And as I said, history would repeat itself. Not only would we face interpersonal violence, but we face institutionalized racism in the form of anti-immigrant policies. Last year, the administration barred Chinese scientists and researchers. The administration suspended migration visas so families couldn't reunite. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas. All these policies disproportionately impacted Asians and excluded us. It was like the Second Chinese Exclusion Act. It excluded us because we were seen as the yellow peril again, threats to America's national security or America's public health. There's one other way, though, history has repeated itself. In all the cases of racism against Asian Americans, we're not just hapless victims, but we've always fought back. And this is why you need Asian American studies, to know how we've been treated, but also know our legacy of resistance, to know that we have leaders and activists that we can model ourselves after, so that we could build and grow and learn from the past. So actually, now I'm going to take a few moments just to give you hints. Let's say if you wanted to build a national global movement, this is what we did at Stop AAPI Hate, and maybe you could apply the same things here at Northeastern or to your own community. Maybe say you want more ethnic studies, you could apply the same sort of lessons and factors to your own situation. So here are some of the factors that have led to the Stop AAPI Hate movement and how we're strategizing and thinking about building the movement. So first of all, we have to know that we're not sort of operating in isolation, but there's a whole broader political context that we Asian Americans are operating and working in. We have a history of the Third World Liberation Front, where students in the past went on strike, right? Where I come from at San Francisco State, students went on strike for 6 months. Think about that, giving up your education for 6 months, doing a co-op, doing a strike as a co-op. Because you care so much. You're not getting paid for it. You're not getting a job out of it. You're doing it because it's the just thing to do. Because of that, they created a College of Ethnic Studies. You know, we have 60 classes in Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. We teach over 3,000 students a semester, just to give you a model. So knowing that I've come out of that history, I have an obligation to maintain that legacy, right? I can't just enjoy that victory. I have to build on that victory. That's what I feel is my responsibility. After 9/11, there was a large spate of Islamophobia, and South Asians, Muslims, Arab Americans, they had to fight the racism that they endured. We at Stop AAPI Hate are learning from our Mensa brothers and sisters, and in fact, the leaders of Stop AAPI include South Asian women who went through this. And so we're building, and I'll tell you later, how, learning and wanting to act in solidarity to fight Islamophobia, because it's the same oppression, it's part of the same system. And we know that we're benefiting from the exposure and the advocacy of Black Lives Matter, right? And I think even at Northeastern, students learned about the Black Lives Matter and how students organized around there to help push for Asian American studies and more Asian American center here. So in this context, we want to acknowledge those who've come before us and to build on what they've already developed. And then, again, acknowledge that because we stand on their shoulders, we have the responsibility to lift others up as well. And so those of you who started a lot of stuff at Northeastern, created this inaugural series, I want to just exhort you, you got this, you've received this gift. Use this gift to build more for future students, right? That's your obligation. So I said, not only do you learn from the past, but you build on the networks and organizations that you already have. And Stop AAPI Hate really benefited from Asian American organizational networks. So if you want to build a movement, you think about what organizations are already in existence that you can mobilize. So again, Stop AAPI Hate is based out of 3 organizations with 150 years of experience. The Asian American movement isn't new. We have 150 years of experience just in our 3 groups, and we utilize that. We've learned from the activists from the Vincent Chin case like Helen Zia. We've learned from South Asians who went through Islamophobia. I remember we had this session with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and we had this strategy session. What would happen if Asians were detained during COVID-19? What would happen if we were racially profiled? What would happen if we had to endure a mass shooting? Because the South Asian community had to deal with it, and so we tried to get ready for it. And all those things happened, right? So we were already learning from it, from experts who went through it just a decade prior. And so again, we want to build on what we already have, to build on the organizations that were established. But the key thing that Stop AAPI Hate did is that we documented the racism, right? It's like developing a 73-page document to hold to Vice Provost Reed. He's got to read it. He can't just, like, it's always there, right? Sorry. In the same way as we collect data, our community knowledge is our power. Asian Americans, you know your community the most. We just got to share that knowledge with others and say, look what's happening to my community. Look at the tuberculosis rates. Look at the homelessness rates. You shine a light on what's going on in your community so that others know. You document it. And not only did we have data, we had numbers, we also had graphic video footage, right, of people being attacked. So together, these individual incidents backed up by the context of a lot of data, that changes hearts and minds. Because if you ever want to build a movement, if you want to fight for more ethnic studies, do surveys of fellow classmates who want ethnic studies. Tell individual stories of why ethnic studies is impactful, and change people's hearts and their minds with data and documentation. That's what academics say. Oh yeah, collect data. It's sort of a nerdy thing to do, but it's true. Data's power. But not only did we have data, we had people. And we were able to mobilize large groups of Asian Americans, especially through social media. And so we created a youth campaign. And in 1 week, because we have social media access, we gathered 100 students nationwide. Those 100 students did data collection. They interviewed 1,000 of their peers, and they wrote their own policy report. This policy report became the basis of Congresswoman Grace Ming's legislation to fight for more ethnic studies funding. High school students got that. They wrote a 100-page report. No, that's not 70. Never mind. They didn't beat you guys. They advocated to the California superintendent of schools that there's so much racial bullying. He wrote a letter or sent a letter to every school district in California telling faculty and staff to be alerted to the bullying that Asian Americans experience. High school students got the superintendent of schools to do that. You can do that with your chancellor and your provost. He's right here, so you could easily talk to him. Again, social media is your tool. When mainstream media doesn't pay attention to us, when we feel unheard or we feel unseen, we used our own media to alert people, and that's what our influencers did. Some of their messages went viral, and as a result, over social media, mainstream media then finally paid attention to us. And because mainstream media paid attention to us, then the government had to pay attention to us. So again, use whatever means you have, your numbers, your organizations, your data, and your alternative voices, your student newspapers, to sound the alarm. And again, we were lucky, especially in California, because we have the few people in power who are supportive of us. So here in this room, you have people supportive of you as Asian American students who really have your back. So there are a few Asian American journalists. They were the ones who told the story of Asian American hate. Almost every journalist I've spoken to has been Asian American. If we didn't have those Asian American journalists, the story wouldn't be told, or it wouldn't be told in the way as well. Because we have elected officials in California, we were heard. And of course, we have people power. So I talked about how people are often being triggered by Asians and going to fight or flight response, right? Asian Americans now are also being triggered. We're threatened by racism. And we're going into fight or flight response as well, right? We want to fight back, and so we're arming ourselves. People are giving their kids mace. We're calling for more policing. That's the fight response. The flight response is we're the racial group least likely to send our kids back to the classroom for fear of racism on the way to school or bullying in the classroom. I don't know how many of you have told your elders to stay home and not go out. The state attorney general in California, he tells his own mom, don't go out. He's the top cop in California, and he tells his mom, who's Filipina, not to go out. So that's the flight response. But the best response that I see the Asian American community do beyond fight or flight is that we're flocking. We're flocking together after Atlanta and Indianapolis to grieve and provide solace to one another. We're flocking at these rallies, and maybe you had one here, to gain support and build allies. We're flocking back to our ethnic enclaves to patronize businesses that have been depressed. We're flocking to chaperone our elders to protect them. You at Northeastern also flocked to grieve and to find support one another. And that's the way to respond to racism. That's the way to respond to threat, is to come together and to use your power collectively, to translate the anger and grief you have over racism into concrete action for good. So don't just feel the pain. Don't try to dismiss it and go into your screens. Translate your anger, translate your distress into action, and push for ethnic studies, push for more services, push to support our elders in the community. We at Stop AAPI Hate have built on the past, been supported by the community. Actually, BTS tweeted out Stop AAPI Hate. I have to say that. And so that became the third trending tweet globally. So we've become a global movement. And because we have this movement, we've been able to make change. Senate passed the hate crimes legislation 94-1. President Biden has issued a bunch of executive orders. And in California, we got $157 million to fight racism. That's historic. For the first time, California, that used to exclude Asians, now recognize that racism exists currently and have historic inequities so that we face disparities in health, mental health, education, community safety. So we got $157 million. Here at Northeastern, the chancellor and the provost have really responded. You got more space. So be grateful for that. Celebrate the victory. You were able to win something. So I'm really proud of Northeastern students for winning that. But that's just the first step, right? Enjoy that victory, celebrate the success, thank those who provided it, but then get your fair share of the pie. There's a lot more to be had. And so we got 157 million, but California's budget is in the trillions. And we're going to fight for the fair share of that $1 trillion budget for our community and for other communities of color as well. So to conclude, I talked about how Asian Americans and probably a lot of Northeastern students often go through identity crisis. Oftentimes we feel invisible to the campus. We're maybe omitted by faculty who don't teach our history. We don't know where we belong, and actually we feel unaccepted because people are telling us, go back home, you effing chink, time and time again. But now's our chance. As we come out of the pandemic, we could actually reimagine the Northeastern university that we want to belong to and reimagine the America we want to belong to. And that takes the last part of social movements I want to talk about, narrative change. We got to change the story of who belongs to America. Who does Northeastern serve? Who belongs to Northeastern? Right? And so I don't necessarily want to go back to normal and belong to America the way it used to be. I want to create America that I want to belong to. An America without the black and white. An America without the insider and outsider. An America, even if you are a foreigner, you're respected. I want to belong to an America where we would treat our elders like Asians treat their elders with respect. America has to be more Asian. So Northeastern students, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for flocking with me today so that we can imagine a Northeastern that we want to belong to, an America that we want to belong to.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeung, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I now would like to invite the audience, both in person and virtual, to ask any kind of questions. If you are here, go ahead and please line up at the microphone where Mika is standing. If you are online, please go ahead and submit your question. Ezra will read them to you once they've collected enough. So I will go ahead and sit on the chair here and ask the first question to serve as the icebreaker, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Okay. Professor Jeung, thank you so much for that very sobering, but very inspiring presentation. And I wanted to basically maybe go back to your work in Stop AAPI Hate. From what I can tell, your organization has collected information and analyzed it. Are there any other sort of facets of your advocacy work? And what kind of needs do you, does your organization identify? And perhaps if I can ask for the students here, how can students, say at Northeastern, get involved?
So there's, so Stop AAPI Hate is like a startup. We just started collecting data, right? Who knew what the data would say? Who knew how much data we would collect? And so what we've done is we've used the data to crank out policy reports. We have national, state-driven policy reports, but we also, like I spoke about, developed a youth report so that we can actually have youth-oriented policies. We are issuing an elderly report to safeguard our elderly. We have a women's report. We have mental health reports. And so we continue to crank out policy reports given what we find in the data to tell the story of our community and then to advocate for it. So we're going to continue to push for, well, we'll continue to collect data and report out on it because it's important to know. The important thing, again, is that not only do we have the numbers, we have the voices of Asian Americans. So we're sharing those incidents, right? And that's what's powerful, is people say, these are real people, just not numbers. When you hear their stories about, no one came to help me, right? That's really impactful. So we're going to continue the policy work. And then we have a bunch of broader policy initiatives. We want to promote educational equity. We really think that ethnic studies is a way to prevent racism. Rather than dealing with racism after it's become a crime, we want to prevent people from being racist to begin with, right? And that's why we need ethnic studies. That's why Northeastern needs ethnic studies. Just a little commercial plug. We're going to push for more expanded civil rights protections. Not everything is a hate crime, but a lot of the cases are civil rights violations. And so we want governments to protect our civil rights. We're going to push for restorative justice so that we don't participate in mass incarceration, but instead hold perpetrators accountable. And we want to push for more community safety measures to protect our elders. So I could go more into detail. So we're doing a lot of policy work, and then we're trying to do the narrative change as well, right? We want to tell, again, a different story about America. To actually rewrite the story of America, to rewrite the story of racism into a story of justice. So, Northeastern, you can come and help an intern at Stop AAPI Hate. You can collect the data and analyze it for us. Everything was student run. So, San Francisco State students were the ones who first analyzed the data. We had a high schooler create our dashboard. So, people from all walks of life have really helped step up.
Thank you for letting us know that. I think that when you think about advocacy organization and the work they do, it seems to create this impression that there's this very high barrier to entry, that this is work done by professionals, but thank you for letting us know that college students, high school students, just anyone with not just the skills, but just the motivation can really make a meaningful difference.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
So people from all walks of life can be activists, right? So we have data scientists contributing to helping us gather the data. We have marketing people telling us this is how you do the social media. We had teachers helping us do curriculum development, right? So whatever you do, whatever co-op you're in, you can apply it to help the community. So think about that. How can I not only use my co-op to develop myself professionally, but how can I use the co-op experience to give back to the community that's given me so much?
Thank you very
I'm sort
much.
of preaching, I'll stop.
Yeah, go for it. I see two individuals there with questions. Maybe both of you can ask your questions, and then Mr. Jeung can take them both, and then afterwards we'll take questions from the virtual audience. So please go ahead and just both ask your questions.
Can you say your name and your?
I'm Maya. I'm a third-year mechanical engineering major here at Northeastern. First, I just want to say thank you for coming here. Really was very informative, and it was very kind of inspiring, I would say. So you're speaking a lot about the ethnic studies and especially Asian studies and being involved with the program at your university. Obviously you're really trying to push for it and stuff. So I was wondering what would your vision be of a very comprehensive as well as fully established ethnic studies program would be, and what ways could current Asian studies and ethnic studies programs could hope to achieve.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question.
Take another person.
Did you? I'm going to forget the first one.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead.
Wait, so am I asking my question first? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead and ask.
So I guess, wait, should I just speak into mic?
Yeah.
Sorry. All right, hi, I'm Abi. I'm a first-year electrical and computer engineering student here at Northeastern. And I guess my question is sort of related to, there's this sort of dilemma, and I guess it's almost an identity crisis that I think myself and a lot of other Asian Americans have been feeling during the pandemic, especially when, even before, so I guess for me that time was during the rhetoric against South Asians with the Muslim ban and all that. But it's sort of, you talked about this, where we don't neatly fit into sort of this, I guess, picture of race in America that has existed for a while, where we're not black or white. We don't fit in there. And I guess some people say we're basically white, we're white adjacent, and so our successes have nothing to do with anything about us. It's just we are, and to some degree, I think that's true. We do benefit from those systems, but also others will just blatantly use our successes and be like, they did it all on their own, therefore, and they'll use that as a tool to oppress other minority groups. And this also applies to the violence we face is not often really neatly just a stereotypical white people oppressing a minority. It often comes from other minority groups who also experience their own struggles. And I guess what I'm asking is, how do we approach this? Because I'm not really comfortable with the approach I've seen within my own community, for example, where people just say, oh, we're the exception to other minority groups, we're not like them. And then I've heard this from my own family members about the Black Lives Matter movement in particular. But I also don't, I guess the other alternative that I've seen is people who will say, you know what, we're privileged, we need to accept that. And I don't know if that's necessarily true because, again, for me, the most shocking moment was this year when someone went out and deliberately murdered 8 Asian American people in Atlanta, and the police just said he was having a bad day. So I guess my question is, how are we supposed to approach this and sort of fit into this, I guess, complex society that exists? Sorry, this is a very broad question, but.
Should I take those two?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So the first question is, what would ethnic studies look like if they were comprehensive and fully funded and you had? And the second is, obvious question is about how do we fit in this complicated picture of race relations where Asians have both racial privileges and racial disadvantages, right? So the first thing in ethnic studies, it's, I can tell you how the original founders of ethnic studies envisioned it. They saw themselves as third world students, aligned with those oppressed everywhere, and they wanted to fight the twin evils of imperialism and racism. So they recognized that there's oppression abroad through colonization, and they recognized that there's racism domestically. And they aligned themselves with other oppressed people. And so from that starting point, they wanted to address those twin evils and then address the community issues that they were facing. So it was very rooted in the community because they were coming from neighborhoods and ethnic enclaves that were depressed. And maybe it might be different for now. You may come from a suburb or you may be more spread out, right? But the original intent for ethnic studies then is not for individual students to learn about their identities. It was to affect community change. So think about this. Education isn't for you and your individual advancement. Education is for the liberation of a community. And students are just supposed to see themselves as part of that community to be liberated. So that was the original intent. And I still think, for me, ethnic studies should hold on to that vision. That education is both and. It's both for the individual student to develop pride and knowledge about their culture and heritage, and gain the social responsibility to go back and affect change for others who are oppressed. And so for me, ethnic studies has that vision of both individual learning plus community change. And that's what Stop AAPI Hate does. It's bringing students to the community to realize this is a concrete issue facing us. Our grandparents are getting attacked. What are we going to do about it, right? And so, and that has a lot to do with our identity, our heritage, our history. But then we can apply what we have. And I think that's a Northeastern model. You go out, and you apply what you learn, you integrate it into your whole life. So for me, a good ethnic studies program helps you as students develop that critical analysis, helps you become culturally competent so you can work with a range of people, right? The society is so global, you need to have those global skills to work across diverse communities. And you need to be able to become problem solvers. Ethnic studies teaches that. So here's my second commercial for ethnic studies. It's an interdisciplinary approach that helps you become ready to be global citizens, to be critical thinkers, to be culturally competent. So who doesn't want to learn how to be? Why wouldn't you want ethnic studies, right? So that's what a comprehensive is. It's not, you're not going to get it from one class. So I applaud Provost. He's like, we want to provide racial diversity training for everybody, but it's going to be more than a workshop, right? We have centuries of racism to unlearn, so we're going to need a lot to learn. So Avi's question is complex too, right? Avi's tough, it's Avi, right?
Yeah.
We're stuck in the racial system, right? it is a system of white supremacy. We're not blaming white individuals for racism. We're saying there's a system that oppresses us. And so we're all part of the system. We're all sort of complicit in the system too. So Asians, we're part of the system. So we should feel guilty because it's wrong, right? Guilt is actually, we should be ashamed because it shouldn't happen. And so that's what I always wrestle. I continually lament over America, right? Because we're part of it, we're benefiting from it, right? You guys get to go to this great school. 7% of the world gets to go to college. You guys go to expensive school, at our school, 50% of the students drop out because they can't afford it. I have students who are homeless, so you guys are super privileged, right? So in some ways you're really privileged, but then you also face the system that sort of categorizes you and visibilizes you. So for me, it's always thinking in that both and way. Yeah, we've got to understand our privileges. We were able to get this Asian American Center full staffed. How can we be thankful for that and fight for others who don't have as much? So I think it's both and thinking. That we're Asian and people of color, that we're male and a community that has to fight sexism, that we're, so for me I think that either or thinking is part of that white supremacist thinking, right? So that we have to disrupt. Does that help? I don't know. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you. Sort of these.
Should I just make my answer short?
No. Don't worry about
Hello. Should I do 2 questions?
2 questions, please.
Okay. So my first question is, what would you say about the need to include mixed-race Asians and the support that they need to feel belonging in Asian communities? And the second question is, I'm wondering what roles you see for faith, spirituality, and interfaith collaboration in the work of stopping Asian hate, as it should have been. Don't we need to be always vocal about racial discrimination, regardless of who the victim is? As an Arab and oh wait, no, I'm so sorry. I mixed these 2 up because a new question came in. Let me start that one over. I'm wondering what roles you see for faith, spirituality, and interfaith collaboration in the work of stopping Asian hate, promoting healing, hope, and empowerment, and effecting transformative inward and outward change.
So the first question has to do, how do we include multiracial Asian Americans? Again, just like we have to re-envision what America is and who belongs to America, we have to re-envision who's Asian American. Right, so multiracial Asian Americans, if they were an ethnicity, I think they'd be the 2nd largest group of Asian Americans. So for me, it's like, how can you not include such a large group? It's like cutting off your arm, I don't know. And so, as I was saying, we have classes on multiracial Asian Americans, right? So we actually have more than one specific class. And in the same way, you have to re-envision Asian America, that it's actually a brown community, right? A third of the community is South Asian, a third of the community is South Asian. So don't picture it as being an East Asian, Chinese, Korean thing, although K-pop is great. It's, you got to think about it as broader and more encompassing. And then, Asian Americans, Afghan refugees are going to come. We're going to fight for Arab American studies, right? That's part of Asian American studies. And so it's a lot more broad, and we want to just continue to be inclusive. So, I give talks about the yellow peril, but it's really the yellow/dusky peril. That just as Chinese were excluded and seen as a peril, when South Asians came in the 1900s, they said, oh, that's the new dusky peril, and then they actually drove out South Asians from the state of Washington and Bellingham. So we're treated similarly, and so we have to come together as a community. The second question is about faith and the role of spirituality. So I'm a religious studies scholar too. I'm a person of faith too, so I think it's like, that's part of who we are as well, right? Just as we're multiracial, we're people of spirituality and faith. And it's actually both the source of oppression that people say, oh, they've attacked our Buddhist temples, right? They just go and knocked over Buddhist statues. That's clear religious racism. So if people use Asian religions to, again, orientalize us, to say we're exotic and different, because they see America as a white Christian nation, right? That's the notion of Christian nationalism, that America belongs to those who are white and Christian. And since Asians are not white, and a lot of us aren't Christian, we don't belong. So religion and race, again, it's that intersectional analysis, are both used to exclude us. And so what we need to do is, again, come together to broaden our vision, to be both, and to realize we're both people of racial backgrounds and religious perspectives, and use our spiritual visions as both ways to critique the world and to hold out hope for the world. So I could go on and on, but then I'll do Refugee. But yeah.
Hi, my name is Diane. I'm a fifth year graphic design and media studies combined major. I've heard as you heard. So I really connected with what you said about how all of this horrendous action and stuff created a lot of catalyst movements, and particularly what you said about intersectionality. So in my final semester, one of my passion projects is to create an app that demonstrates intersectionality and how different racial groups can empathize with each other, and even on top of that, how sustainability and environmentalism kind of plays into it. And a question I have for you is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to entry for individuals to learn about these heavy topics such as racism and hate crimes, etc.?
Good question. So she wants to build an app, and it's what are the barriers to dealing with racism? That's a good question.
I was trying to recruit her to come take one of my classes. Hi, I'm Dr. Regine Rochelle. I'm a professor of culture, societies, and global studies, and gender and sexuality studies, and the director of Africana studies. And so much of what you said resonated with me. I feel like I have 1,000 questions. We could talk so much. But what I really want to focus on is what you talked about with regards to flocking. I think it's such a beautiful metaphor, and for me as a person of faith too, it really resonates. And I wanted to think about that in relation to my role here as director of Africana Studies, and how, perhaps you've seen examples of how members of the Black community also, whether as activists or academics within the movement, have partnered or been co-conspirators. I don't like the term allies, but I love co-conspirator. So I was wondering if you could give us some examples of where you've experienced that, and perhaps also some imagining as to what that might look like, particularly as we think about Africana studies in relation to ethnic studies and Asian American studies here at Northeastern. Thank you.
Thanks. Wow. So the first question is, what are the barriers to just addressing racism, and how would you build an app to make people to sort of think and share their stories? I think, okay, here's one answer. There's probably lots of answers, but this is what I think. I talked about how whiteness is seen on top of America, that whiteness is seen as the top of America's racial hierarchy. If you're an immigrant and a voluntary immigrant, you come to America for the American dream. And so whiteness sort of embodies that American dream. Asians don't want to be white people, but we want whiteness. We want the status that whites have. We want the power that whites have. We want the meritocratic treatment that whites have. We want to even be seen as beautiful the way whites are. So when you come to America, the drive is towards whiteness. That's why you came, because you think that's the American dream, right? So the logic of immigration is actually assimilation and adaptation. That leads to anti-Blackness. If you're going to try to say, okay, these people are on power, these people are the beautiful ones, these are the people who are rich, you see those who are mass incarcerated, those who face all these disparities, who do you want to be like? Who do you want to emulate? You're obviously going to go, well, I'd rather be like those on top, right? And so the system, for me, pushes towards whiteness. And that's one of the barriers to addressing racism, because who wants to be, this is the anti-Blackness of our community. Who wants to be seen as a disenfranchised, oppressed people? And so we have to actually, so we sort of like want to ignore the pain. We want to ignore our oppression. We want to aspire to be like that. Maybe our parents do, maybe our current, but maybe we do individually too. And so for me, that's one of the issues we have to do is how can we actually build solidarity with others rather than wanting just to gain, I don't know what you call, how do we become co-conspirators rather than complicitors? I don't know what that term is. Write something about that, will you? So, how do we become co-conspirators? And how can ethnic studies make us co-conspirators? So in my own life, again, the Third World Liberation Front came out of the strike led by the Black Student Union. And so they let it out. And then the Third World Liberation Front of Latinos, Asians, American Indians joined in. And so I'm not the fruit, I'm not a baby of it, but I received the gifts of solidarity. And I've got all these African American aunties and grandmas in our college who support me so much during Stop AAPI, and that's what I'm so thankful for. They are the ones who flocked with me. They're like my mom hens, and they protected me, and I'm so grateful. My union really supported us too, and so we had a union and a committee of racial justice, and there was predominantly African American faculty. They were the first to fund Stop AAPI and a lot of curriculum development. So I've been the beneficiary of a lot of solidarity and a lot of support. And so just concretely, I know that we need to build African American, Asian American solidarity. Actually, that's, again, one of our initiatives of Stop AAPI Hate is to better promote that and to find out what are the joint projects that we could work on. So for ethnic studies, it's even if you're a research department researching the stories where we have been connected and worked together, and there's a lot of stories of solidarity. Also, actually researching sources of friction, right? And anti-blackness within the Asian community and anti-Asianness in the Asian American community. We got to dig out, our skeletons in our closet. So I think joint research, and then for me, what I would want to, this is actually what we did. At least in the Bay Area, there's a lot of Asians moving into historically African American communities, and there are racial tensions, and there are issues and conflicts. So our students hosted Lunar New Year Black History Month celebrations. And I know that here in Northeastern, we celebrate Asian History Month in January and Black History Month in February. So on January 31st, February 1st, you do the combo things. I know that Rachel wants to do that kind of work. Did you find out we celebrate both, right? And then we learn from each other. So
that's great. I love that.
There's lots of ways.
Another few questions from the virtual audience. As an Arab and a Muslim in the States, I felt after 9/11 that victimizations of Middle Eastern people were not always vehemently rejected as they should have been. Muslims and Arabs were more or less left alone by other minorities. Don't we always need to be vocal about racial discrimination regardless of who the victim is? Don't we always need to be vocal about racial discrimination regardless of who the victim is? And for the second question, Northeastern is a growing global university with students and campus communities in various regions. How does an institution of this size and magnitude work to ensure the intersectional approach to anti-racist work is intentional and impactful within different regional communities that belong in the university network, but also aligned across campus?
Okay. So the first question is about Islamophobia and racism of Muslims face onto Islamophobia. And shouldn't we be vocal about that? And obviously, yes, right? So this actually, it's sort of sad. I think of it like Lord of the Rings and the Eye of Sauron, And so sometimes racism is shown on the African American community, but then the media then shows it, racism against the Asian American community, right? And then the attention then goes on to the Muslim community. And so the Eye of Sauron goes everywhere, and we're all oppressed, and we're all being attacked by Sauron, and we all need hobbits and elves and dwarves to come to our help. So yeah, we do need to act in solidarity and point it out wherever it shows up. And I think that's part of our Stop AAPI Hate analysis. It's obviously not just an Asian American issue. Actually, this is what we say. The racism against Asian Americans isn't an Asian American issue, it's other people's issue, right? They're the ones with the problem, they're the ones who are racist. That's why they need ethnic studies, right? Teach them not to be so racist. But Asians, we may be racist against other groups, so we need ethnic studies too. So it's, we all need to unlearn our racism, and we have to recognize how we're both advantage and disadvantage in similar ways and in different ways. So I agree. The question about DEI, and that's a big question of how to institutionalize it with an intersectional approach. You got to put your money where your mouth is, and you just can't just talk about it, but you got to actually use data to track trends in hiring, retention, track who's coming to Northeastern, look at both gender, sexuality, but also look at immigration status and income. So we at San Francisco State now, you got the Asians are seen as a model minority. Chinese aren't seen as underrepresented minorities, but low-income Chinese drop out at just the high rates as other people of color, students of color, right? So if you combine race plus class, that really impacts communities. So you need that disaggregated data. So you got to document what's happening, and then you got to. It's really hard. You got to institutionalize practices that hold every division accountable. So there's accountability practices that are fair and just. Actually, for any of you who want to do that, this is a burgeoning field, this DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to hold corporations accountable, to hold schools accountable, to hold government institutions accountable. There's a lot of things that need to be done. And same with the environment. Just like you need to do sustainability reviews, you need to do diversity reviews. So there's lots of jobs out there that need to be built.
So much. We're just going to take, I just want to let everyone know it's 5:33. Folks need to leave, but we are going to take 2 more questions and then wrap up.
Those people?
Have a day, Dr. Jeung. First, I wanted to say, Suzus Maasi, I actually use your Stop AAPI Hate website in my Trans-Pacific Rhetorics class, and they really enjoyed being able to see your statistics and to be made more aware of the circumstances faced by so many of us in the community. I'm Tabitha. I teach in the English department, and what appealed to me most about your particular presentation was the inclusion of Pacific Islander in the title. And as a third-generation Filipina colonial settler from the island of Guahan, I'm really interested in how you envision this relationship between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders manifesting in, as Cheyenne and Dr. Jean Charles said, in co-conspiring, in looking at intersectional relationships, and looking at how we can move in solidarity with one another, especially in the time of COVID-19. So if you could speak to that relationship as well as the possibilities as well as the limits of the AAPI moniker. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we're Stop AAPI Hate. The question is, where are PIs and AAPI Hate, right? And are we just tokenizing the group? Are we invisibilizing the group? Are we marginalizing the group? It's a real valid question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think we've actually had listening sessions with the Pacific Islanders who feel like, why are we included in this umbrella category, right? Where's the data about our community? Where are the issues? And I think it's a real valid concern. Just quickly, we named it AAPI because we come out of the Asian Pacific Policy Planning Council. And initially, we asked different PI organizations, and they said it was okay to be included. But then, again, other groups questioned the use of the name. And so we've had listening sessions, and we're partnering with other PI groups to do PI-specific research, so let it be PI-led. And to use PI methodologies. And we are also, it's the same thing, we want to reframe that way to partner, to be co-conspirers. So we know the way AAPI has been constructed has been damaging, so we want to apologize, change how we do things, and re-envision that partnership. And so if they want to take us to take out PI from our name, we'll do that. If we want to figure out how do we lift up. So PI hate might be different from how Asian Americans experience hate, right? It could be in the form of police brutality. It could be in the form of COVID-19 misinformation. So there's lots of forms of hate, not just impersonal harassment. So yeah, we take it really seriously, and something we have to be held accountable to. So thank you.
One question, please.
Hi, my name is Sydney Braun. I'm actually a journalism student at Boston University, and my question, it's a lot less complex than the previous questions were deep, but I was just wondering, you said in the beginning that you attempted to take this data to the state and see if they could form a database on the state level, and they said effectively no. Do you ever see Stop AAPI Hate becoming a part of a federal or national, do you see it becoming part of the government on a federal or national level, or do you just see it as continuing as a private organization on its own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so we've got a lot more data because we're a trusted community partner. We know that, in 15% of the assault cases, they call police, but that's 85% they don't even bother calling the government, right? So why would Asians report to us instead of the government, right? Is it mistrust? Is it language barrier? We're in 15 languages. We're in Pacific Islander languages. So maybe they know that we're more of a voice and representative for them than the government officials. So actually, we didn't realize this. This is sort of a fortuitous side effect. We need to develop community government partnerships. So many people may not trust the government, but maybe they'll trust us as an agency. And so we got to relay that information to the government. Just like you may not want to go to mental health services of Northeastern, but you go to the Asian American Center to get support. And then the Asian American Center provides. And so I think it's a partnership that will happen with the government. We are. And now, so, we've called out the Biden administration and said, this is happening, what are you doing about it? But at the same time, a lot of government agencies have reached out to Stop AAPI Hate from listening sessions, so I do appreciate that. So that's a tricky position. The same thing with Northeastern students. They called and demanded 73 pages, right? They've gotten some concessions from Northeastern as an institution. So is it always going to be an adversarial relationship, or is it going to be a relationship where you cooperate? And it's going to be both and. You've got to know when you can cooperate, and you've got to know when you have to hold them accountable. So I think it's the same thing for us. We're going to cooperate when we can, and then we're going to hold the government accountable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Before I conclude this event and thank Professor Jeung for his time, I have two business items I need to conclude myself. Senior Vice Provost Carl Reed asked me to thank the Dr. Richard O'Brien and John D. O'Brien's African American Institute for actually hosting this event. And I would like to invite Mika, maybe you can just say a few words about the next coming event, and then we can conclude.
Thank you. So I just wanted to take a brief moment to invite everyone to our next event in this speaker series, which the speaker for which will be Professor Jeung from USC, speaking on amidst pandemic and racial upheaval where Asian Americans fit. This will take place on Monday, October 7th, 4:00 p.m. At the East Village 17 room. If you have any questions about it, please email us at csgs@northeastern.edu. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, please join me in thanking once again Professor Russell Jeung for his very illuminating presentation, and thank you for his time.